In the ashes of a divided nation, America stood at a crossroads. The Civil War had ended, but the scars it left behind were deeper than the shattered cities and broken railroads. Families grieved, communities struggled to rebuild, and a new battle began, not with cannons and rifles, but with laws, politics, and the fight for equality. This was the era of Reconstruction, a time of hope, betrayal, and transformation. Join us as we uncover the untold struggles and powerful legacies that shaped the United States in the wake of its bloodiest conflict. April 12, 1861. The first gray light of dawn crept across Charleston Harbor as silence hung heavy in the air. Inside the battered walls of Fort Sumter, Union soldiers braced themselves, low on supplies, weary from weeks of siege. Across the water, the newly declared Confederate States of America waited with fingers on the trigger. Then, thunder. A single cannon roared, followed by another and another, until the sky itself seemed to shatter. Fiery shells arced overhead, slamming into Sumter's brick walls, blasting smoke and dust into the morning air. With every strike, the fragile cracks that had long divided North and South were ripped open into chasms of war. To the Confederates, this was no mere bombardment. It was a proclamation, a second war of independence, the chance to carve out a nation built on their own terms. To the Union, it was rebellion, a treasonous assault on the very heart of America. The barrage continued for 34 relentless hours. When the guns finally fell silent, the Union garrison surrendered. The first shots had been fired and there was no turning back. The American Civil War had begun. Long before the cannons thundered at Fort Sumter, the roots of war had already sunk deep into American soil. In the South, endless fields of cotton stretched toward the horizon, feeding the factories of Europe and making Southern planters some of the richest men on earth. But this wealth rested on a brutal foundation: the enslavement of millions of Black Americans. Without slavery, the Southern way of life would collapse. In the North, the world looked different. Cities swelled with immigrants, industry surged, and moral opposition to slavery grew louder with every passing year. To many Northerners, slavery was not only a stain on America's soul, but a threat to its future. To Southerners, that same opposition was terrifying, an assault on their prosperity, their honor, and their very survival. Tensions mounted with each compromise, each new territory added to the Union. Would it embrace freedom or chains? Every debate in Congress felt like a battle in miniature. Every vote was a skirmish in a war yet to come. By the mid-19th century, Americans were no longer one nation divided. They were two nations trapped inside a single body, waiting for the first spark to set it ablaze. As America expanded westward, a deadly question followed every wagon train. Would the new lands embrace freedom or slavery? Nowhere was that question bloodier than in Kansas. In the 1850s, settlers from north and south poured into the territory, rifles in hand, determined to decide its fate at the ballot box, or by the blade. Towns were burned, families butchered, and partisan newspapers fanned the flames. Leading Kansas was no longer politics, it was civil war in miniature. Amid the chaos rose a man whose name still haunts American memory: John Brown. A fiery abolitionist who believed slavery could only be purged with blood, Brown struck terror into the South. His raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 was meant to ignite a slave uprising. Instead, it ended in his capture and execution. To Northerners, he died a martyr. To Southerners, he was proof that the North was willing to unleash racial Armageddon. At the same time, a new political force emerged: the Republican Party. Born from opposition to slavery's spread, it soon became the sworn enemy of the South. With every skirmish, every speech, the divide widened. America was not just debating slavery anymore. It was marching toward war. November 6, 1860. The ballots were counted, and the verdict was clear. Abraham Lincoln would become the 16th President of the United States. To Northerners, he was a moderate voice, promising not to abolish slavery outright, but to contain it. To Southerners, his victory was nothing less than a nightmare. Not a single Southern electoral vote had gone his way, and yet he would soon control the presidency, the army, and the future of the Union. In their eyes, the Black Republican had been sent to destroy them. He would stack the government with abolitionists, incite slave rebellions, strangle their economy, and strip away the foundation of their society. Panic turned into fury. Politicians thundered in state assemblies that the South's honor and survival could be protected only through one drastic act: secession. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina became the first to break away, declaring the Union a broken contract. Within weeks, 6 more states followed. By February 1861, they had formed the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis sworn in as president. The United States was tearing itself apart, and with Fort Sumter still in Union hands, the question was no longer if war would come, only when. By early 1861, a new flag flew across the South. The Confederate States of America had been born, its leaders declaring themselves heirs to the Revolution, fighting for liberty and self-rule. But beneath the speeches and ceremonies, everyone knew the truth. The Confederacy had been founded to protect slavery, the cornerstone of its wealth and power. Yet from the very start, the South faced staggering odds. The Union boasted over 20 million people, while the Confederacy had barely 9 million, nearly half of them enslaved. Northern factories outproduced the South 10-1 in weapons, ships, and vital supplies. In raw numbers, the Confederacy could never hope to match its rival. But Southern leaders had a plan. They believed Europe, starved for cotton, would rush to their side. They believed the fighting spirit of their men, raised in a culture of honor and violence, would outmatch the so-called weak Northerners. They believed if they could simply hold out long enough, the Union would grow weary of war and sue for peace. It was a bold gamble, a gamble that would soon be tested on the battlefield, where pride, fear, and blood would decide the fate of a nation. The summer of 1861. Crowds of curious Northerners packed picnic baskets and rode out to watch the Union Army crush the rebellion at a little railroad junction called Manassas. What they saw instead was chaos. In the smoke and confusion, Confederate General Thomas Jackson stood firm, rallying his men like a stone wall. By day's end, Union troops fled in panic. The South had won its first great victory, and with it, the illusion of a short, bloodless war was shattered forever. The following spring, the Union struck back. At Shiloh in Tennessee, cannons thundered for 2 days as tens of thousands fell in one of the bloodiest battles yet. The South fought with fury, but the Union inched closer to controlling the Mississippi. Soon after, New Orleans, the Confederacy's greatest city, was captured, cutting deep into Southern pride. In the East, Robert E. Lee emerged as the South's boldest commander, daring enough to invade the North itself. But at Antietam in 1862, his gamble nearly ended in disaster. Union forces outnumbered him 2-1, and the fields of Maryland ran red with the blood of 22,000 men, the single bloodiest day in American history. It was no victory for either side, but for Abraham Lincoln, it was the moment he had been waiting for. After Antietam's bloody stalemate, Abraham Lincoln seized the moment. On January 1st, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring freedom for enslaved people in the rebelling states. The war was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was about destroying slavery itself. The South's last hope, foreign recognition from Britain and France, vanished overnight. No European power would march to defend a nation fighting for bondage. That summer, the war reached its climax. In the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, Robert E. Lee gambled everything on one last push into Union territory. By late 1863, the Confederacy was bleeding from within. Union blockades strangled Southern ports, cotton rotted on the docks, and food grew scarce. Prices for basic goods soared beyond reach as runaway inflation devoured the value of Confederate money. In the streets of Richmond and beyond, desperate women rioted for bread while soldiers' families starved at home. The burden of war fell heaviest on the poor. Wealthy planters, the very men who had demanded secession, often found ways to avoid conscription, while small farmers were forced to surrender their crops to the government. Resentment spread like wildfire. Some men deserted, slipping back to care for their families. Others took up arms against their own Confederate officials, waging a shadow war behind Southern lines. Even slavery itself began to unravel. Enslaved men and women, emboldened by Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, fled plantations in droves, crippling the Southern economy and swelling Union ranks with new recruits. For many Confederate soldiers, the glory they had once imagined was gone, replaced by hunger, doubt, and despair. What had begun as a war for honor and independence now felt like a slow march into ruin. And in 1864, Union generals were preparing to deliver the final crushing blows. By 1864, the Union unleashed a new strategy: total war. General William Tecumseh Sherman carved a fiery path through Georgia, burning crops, railroads, and cities in his infamous March to the Sea. His message was brutal and clear. The South would know no peace until it surrendered. Farms lay in ashes, towns in ruins, and the Confederate will to fight crumbled with every mile. Meanwhile, Ulysses S. Grant hammered Robert E. Lee's army in Virginia. The two titans clashed again and again, in the wilderness, at Spotsylvania, at Cold Harbor, battles so savage they seemed endless. Grant refused to retreat. He pinned Lee inside Petersburg, cutting supply lines, starving the Confederates in a grinding siege. By early 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Sherman marched north, uniting with Grant's forces, while desertion hollowed Lee's ranks. Richmond, the proud capital of the South, fell in flames. Still, Lee fought on, his army ragged, barefoot, and hungry, yet unwilling to surrender their honor. But the noose was closing. Surrounded, outnumbered, and out of supplies, Lee faced the inevitable. The dream of Southern independence had burned to embers. The only question left was, how would the war finally end? April 1865. The Confederate Army was a shadow of its former self, starving, exhausted, and cornered. Robert E. Lee, knowing further bloodshed was pointless, rode to a quiet Virginia courthouse called Appomattox. There, in a simple farmhouse parlor, he met Ulysses S. Grant. The two men, opposites in every way, agreed to end 4 years of slaughter. Grant offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers could return home, keeping their horses to plant crops for spring. The war was over. For the Union, it was victory. For the Confederacy, it was death. Over 600,000 Americans had perished. Brothers, fathers, sons. Entire cities lay in ruins, and the South society was shattered beyond recognition. Slavery, the very institution that had sparked secession, was abolished forever. Yet peace did not bring unity overnight. The scars of war ran deep, and the struggle for freedom and equality would rage for generations to come. Still, Appomattox marked a turning point. The United States, fractured and bleeding, had survived its greatest trial. The Civil War had begun as a fight for union. It ended as a revolution, one that redefined the meaning of America itself. The Civil War ended with cannons falling silent, but its echoes still shape America today. Reconstruction was more than rebuilding cities, it was about redefining freedom, justice, and the meaning of a united nation. There were victories and heartbreaks, promises fulfilled and promises broken. Yet out of the ruins rose a stronger identity, forged in struggle and resilience. The scars of that era remind us how fragile unity can be and how powerful hope remains. The legacy of Reconstruction is not just history, it's a story still unfolding in the very fabric of America.